Sarah Chen had always been different from other girls in her small mountain village. While they learned cooking and sewing, she practiced with her father's old hunting rifle behind the barn. Her hands were steady, her eyes sharp, and her aim was something that made the local men uncomfortable during harvest festivals. The trouble started when Captain Morrison arrived with his squad of 12 soldiers. They came to the village claiming to search for rebels hiding in the mountains. But Sarah knew better. She had seen the way Morrison's eyes lingered on the young women, the way his men took food without paying, and how they made themselves comfortable in houses that weren't theirs. Her father owned the village's only gun shop. It was small but well-stocked, inherited from her grandfather who had been a marksman in the army. Sarah knew every weapon in that shop like they were family members. She could take apart a rifle blindfolded and put it back together in minutes. On the third day of the soldiers' stay, Sarah was cleaning rifles in the back room when she heard shouting from the front of the shop. Through the thin wooden wall, she could hear Captain Morrison's voice getting louder and angrier. He was demanding that her father hand over all the weapons and ammunition. "These are legal weapons," her father said calmly. "I have proper licenses for everything." "Not anymore," Morrison laughed. "New military orders. All weapons must be surrendered immediately." Sarah pressed her ear to the wall. She knew this wasn't about military orders. Morrison wanted to control the village completely, and taking away their means of protection was the first step. Her father's voice became worried as he tried to negotiate. "Please, Captain, this is my livelihood. How will I feed my family?" "That's not my problem, old man." Sarah heard the sound of boots moving around the shop, her father's inventory being roughly handled. Her heart raced as she realized what was happening. Morrison wasn't just taking the weapons to control the village. He was planning something worse. She quietly picked up her favorite rifle, a Winchester that had belonged to her grandfather. It was perfectly balanced and had never failed her. She checked the chamber and found it loaded. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she prepared for what might come next. The voices in the front room grew more heated. She heard her father protest as boxes crashed to the floor. Then came a sound that made her blood run cold. Her father crying out in pain. Through a crack in the door, she saw Morrison strike her father with the butt of a rifle. "Load everything into the truck," Morrison ordered his men. "And if anyone in this village gives us trouble, they'll get worse than this old fool." Sarah's father fell to his knees, blood trickling from his forehead. The soldiers began grabbing weapons from the walls and shelves, throwing them carelessly into wooden crates. Years of her father's careful work was being destroyed in minutes. She watched one soldier pick up her grandfather's antique pistol and examine it roughly. Another grabbed the hunting rifles that local farmers used to protect their crops from wild animals. These weren't weapons of war. They were tools that helped families survive. Morrison walked around the shop like he owned it, occasionally kicking at her father who was still on the floor. "This village needs to learn respect," he said to his men, starting with taking away anything that might make them feel brave. Sarah knew she had to act. Her father was hurt and helpless. The village would be defenseless without their weapons. But she was just one person against 12 trained soldiers. Her mind raced through possibilities as she watched them continue their theft. The Winchester felt familiar and comforting in her hands. She had won every shooting competition in 3 neighboring villages. She could hit a coin tossed in the air or split an arrow with another arrow like stories from old legends. But those were targets that didn't shoot back. Through the crack in the door, she saw Morrison bend down to speak directly to her father. "Where's that daughter of yours? I heard she's quite the little shooter." His voice had a tone that made Sarah's skin crawl. Maybe she needs some special training from a real soldier. That was the moment Sarah knew running wasn't an option. Morrison wasn't just here to steal weapons. He had been watching her, planning something terrible. The way he smiled when he mentioned her name told her everything she needed to know about his real intentions. Her father looked up despite his pain and said firmly, "She's not here. She left yesterday to visit relatives." Morrison laughed and grabbed her father by the shirt. "Don't lie to me, old man. I saw her this morning. A pretty little thing who thinks she can handle guns like a man." He shoved her father back down. "We'll find her soon enough." Sarah's heart pounded as she realized she was trapped. The back room had only one exit, and it led right into the main shop where Morrison and his men were working. The windows were too small to climb through, and even if she could escape, she couldn't leave her father bleeding on the floor. She checked her rifle one more time and took a deep breath. 12 men with military training against one village girl with a hunting rifle. The odds were terrible, but Sarah had never backed down from a challenge. Her grandfather had always told her that courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about doing what was right even when you were terrified. Sarah waited until most of the soldiers had their backs turned, busy loading weapons into their truck parked outside. Only Morrison and 2 others remained in the shop with her father. She knew this might be her only chance. Moving as quietly as possible, she crept to the door separating the back room from the main shop. The old wooden floor creaked slightly under her feet, but the soldiers were making enough noise that they didn't notice. Her heart hammered so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. Through the crack in the door, she could see Morrison examining her father's prized possession, a beautiful carved rifle that had been in their family for generations. He was holding it carelessly, running his dirty fingers over the intricate woodwork that her great-grandfather had spent months perfecting. "This one's worth some good money," Morrison said to one of his men. "Real craftsmanship. Shame to waste it on mountain peasants who don't appreciate fine things." Her father tried to sit up straighter despite his injuries. "Please, that belonged to my grandfather. It has great sentimental value to our family." Morrison looked down at him with disgust. "Sentiment doesn't win wars, old man. This rifle will serve the military much better than gathering dust in your pathetic little shop." Sarah felt anger burning in her chest. That rifle represented 4 generations of her family's history. Her great-grandfather had carved it himself. Her grandfather had carried it through 2 wars, and her father had taught her to shoot with it when she was just 8 years old. Morrison had no right to take it. The captain continued his cruel inspection of the shop, occasionally smashing items that couldn't be easily carried away. He knocked over a display case full of her father's handmade ammunition, scattering bullets across the floor. Then he spotted something that made his eyes light up with greed. Well, Morrison said, walking toward a locked cabinet in the corner. "What do we have hidden away here?" Sarah's blood went cold. That cabinet contained her father's most valuable firearms, collector's pieces that were worth more than most people in the village made in a year. More importantly, it also held her personal target shooting medals and the special rifle she had been saving money to buy for the upcoming regional competition. "The key," Morrison demanded, holding out his hand to her father. "I don't have it with me," her father lied, though Sarah knew he kept it on a chain around his neck under his shirt. Morrison's face darkened with anger. He kicked her father hard in the ribs, making him cry out in pain. "Don't test my patience, old fool. My men know how to make people very cooperative." One of the other soldiers, a young man who looked barely older than Sarah, seemed uncomfortable with the violence. "Captain, maybe we should just take what we can carry and move on. We're supposed to be searching for rebels, not what, Private?" Morrison's voice was dangerously quiet. "Are you questioning my methods?" The young soldier quickly looked away. "No, sir. Just thinking about our timeline." Morrison smiled coldly. "We have plenty of time. This village needs to learn proper respect for authority. Sometimes that requires making examples of people who think they're too good to follow orders." Sarah watched in horror as Morrison grabbed her father by the hair and pulled his head back. The chain with the key was now visible around her father's neck. Morrison reached for it with his free hand, his intentions clear. That was the moment Sarah knew she couldn't wait any longer. She had hoped the soldiers might finish their theft and leave without further violence. But Morrison's behavior was escalating. If she didn't act now, her father might not survive this encounter. She slowly pushed the door open just wide enough to slip through. Her rifle was ready, though she prayed she wouldn't have to use it. Maybe she could surprise them, get the drop on them long enough to create some kind of standoff. But as soon as she stepped into the main room, the old floorboard beneath her foot let out a loud creak. Morrison's head snapped up immediately, his military training making him instantly alert to any new sound or movement. "There she is," he said, with a satisfied grin, still holding her father by the hair. "The famous little sharpshooter I've been hearing so much about." The 2 soldiers with him immediately reached for their weapons, but Morrison held up a hand to stop them. "Easy, boys. Let's not scare the girl. She looks like she wants to play with the grown-ups." Sarah kept her rifle trained on Morrison, though her hands were shaking slightly. She had never pointed a weapon at another human being before. All her experience was with targets, bottles, and tin cans. The weight of potentially taking a life felt crushing. "Let my father go," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Take the weapons and leave. We won't cause any trouble. Morrison laughed, a sound that contained no humor at all. Oh, sweetheart, you're in no position to make demands. Do you see how many of us there are? Do you really think you can shoot us all before we take that pretty little gun away from you? He was right, and Sarah knew it. Even if she could somehow hit Morrison, the other two soldiers would overwhelm her immediately. But she also knew that surrendering meant accepting whatever terrible fate Morrison had planned for her and her father. Maybe we can't all be shot, Morrison continued, but I guarantee your old man here will be the first to die if you don't put that rifle down right now. To emphasize his point, Morrison pulled a pistol from his holster and pressed it against her father's temple. Her father's eyes met hers across the room, and she saw something there that surprised her. Instead of fear or pleading, she saw determination and a slight nod toward the back corner of the shop. Following his gaze, Sarah realized what he was trying to tell her. In that corner stood an old mirror that gave her a perfect view of the soldiers outside loading the truck. If she positioned herself correctly, she might be able to see all of Morrison's men and plan her next move. But first, she had to find a way out of this immediate standoff without getting her father killed. Sarah's mind raced as she faced the impossible choice. Morrison's pistol remained pressed against her father's head, while his two men had their weapons drawn and pointed at her. Outside, she could hear the other soldiers still loading weapons into their truck, unaware of the standoff happening inside the shop. You have 10 seconds to drop that rifle, Morrison said calmly. Then I'm going to paint these walls with your father's brains and we'll take you anyway. Your choice, little girl. Her father looked at her with eyes that somehow conveyed both love and a desperate message. He mouthed something she couldn't quite understand. Then his gaze flicked toward a specific spot on the floor near Morrison's feet. Sarah suddenly remembered what her father was trying to tell her. When she was younger, he had shown her a loose floorboard that concealed an old hiding spot used during the previous war. If she could somehow get Morrison to step on it, the board might give way and throw him off balance. But getting him to move would require a distraction, and she was running out of time. 5 seconds, Morrison counted down. 43, wait, Sarah called out. I'll put it down. Just don't hurt him anymore. She slowly began to lower her rifle, but instead of placing it on the floor, she deliberately let it swing toward the wall where several loaded guns hung on display hooks. As the barrel moved, it knocked against a lever-action rifle hanging there. The hanging rifle fell from its hook with a loud clatter, and in that split second of distraction, Sarah's father threw his full weight sideways. Morrison stumbled forward to maintain his grip, stepping directly onto the loose floorboard Sarah had been hoping for. The old wood gave way with a sharp crack. Morrison's foot plunged through the floor up to his ankle, throwing him completely off balance. His pistol fired wildly into the ceiling as he fell, and Sarah's father rolled away from him. Sarah didn't waste the opportunity. She brought her rifle back up and fired a shot that shattered the window behind the two other soldiers, sending glass flying everywhere. They dove for cover, giving her precious seconds to act. The back door, her father shouted, struggling to his feet despite his injuries. But Sarah knew they wouldn't make it that way. The other soldiers outside would hear the shots and surround the building within moments. Instead, she did something that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. She ran directly toward Morrison, who was still struggling to pull his foot out of the broken floorboard. Before he could raise his pistol again, she swung her rifle like a club, striking his wrist and sending his weapon spinning across the room. You little witch, Morrison snarled, finally freeing his foot and lunging toward her. Sarah was smaller and lighter, but she was also faster. She dodged his grab and kicked the broken floorboard, widening the hole and making it even harder for him to maintain his balance. Then she snatched the ring of keys from around his neck, not the one for her father's cabinet, but Morrison's own keys that she had noticed earlier. The two other soldiers were recovering from their shock and moving to surround her when the front door burst open. 3 more of Morrison's men rushed in, having heard the gunshot. Sarah was now facing 6 armed men in the confines of the small shop. "Grab her!" Morrison roared, still struggling with his footing. But Sarah had one advantage they hadn't considered. She knew every inch of this shop, every hiding spot, every piece of furniture. She rolled behind the main counter just as bullets started flying, using the solid oak construction as cover. From her position behind the counter, she could see her father crouched behind an overturned table. He was hurt but alive, and he was holding Morrison's pistol that had been knocked away during the struggle. "Sarah," he called out. "The ammunition storage." Sarah understood immediately. Behind the counter was a trapdoor leading to the basement, where her father stored bulk ammunition and gunpowder. If she could get down there, she would have access to enough firepower to even the odds significantly. But reaching the trapdoor meant exposing herself to the 6 soldiers who were now spread throughout the shop, using furniture and doorways as cover. They had superior numbers and military training, while she had only her knowledge of the terrain and her shooting skills. Morrison had finally gotten himself steady and was coordinating his men's positions. 2 of you cover the back exit. Johnson, watch that window. The rest of us will flush her out of there. Sarah knew they were closing in, but she also noticed something important. In their rush to catch her, the soldiers had positioned themselves poorly. They were too close together, and several of them were standing near her father's display of antique lanterns that hung from the ceiling on long chains. She had an idea that was either brilliant or completely insane. Using Morrison's keys, she quietly unlocked the trapdoor beside her and dropped them down into the darkness below. The small sound they made hitting the basement floor was enough to make 2 soldiers move closer to investigate. Then Sarah did something that went against every survival instinct she had. Instead of staying hidden behind the counter, she stood up in full view of all 6 men and raised her hands as if surrendering. "All right," she called out loudly. "I give up." "You win." Morrison smiled triumphantly. "Smart girl. Now step out from behind there slowly, and keep your hands where we can see them." Sarah began to move out from behind the counter, but as she did, she grabbed one of the chains holding the antique lanterns above. With a quick, practiced motion learned from years of hunting, she pulled the chain hard and released it. The heavy brass lantern swung across the room like a pendulum, striking one soldier in the head and knocking him unconscious. The chain reaction caused 2 other lanterns to swing wildly, creating chaos as the men tried to dodge the heavy metal objects flying through the air. In the confusion, Sarah dropped back down and reached for the open trapdoor, but just as she was about to disappear into the basement, she felt a strong hand grab her ankle. Morrison had anticipated her move and positioned himself perfectly to catch her. His grip was like iron, and he was pulling her back up with determined strength. "Going somewhere, little rabbit?" he growled. Morrison's grip on Sarah's ankle was crushing, his military-trained strength far greater than anything she had prepared for. He pulled her up from the trapdoor opening with brutal efficiency, his face twisted with rage and determination. "Did you really think you could outsmart me, girl?" Morrison snarled, dragging her across the floor. "I've been hunting rebels and troublemakers for 15 years. You're nothing but a child playing with toys." Sarah kicked frantically with her free leg, connecting with Morrison's shoulder, but he barely flinched. His other soldiers were recovering from the chaos of the swinging lanterns, and she could see them moving to surround her again. Her father was still behind his overturned table, but he was too injured and too far away to help. "Hold her arms," Morrison ordered 2 of his men. "I think our little sharpshooter needs to learn some respect." The soldiers moved in to grab her, but Sarah wasn't finished fighting. As they reached for her, she remembered something her father had taught her years ago during their hunting trips. When a wild animal has you cornered, the only option is to make yourself too dangerous to handle safely. She went completely limp in Morrison's grip, then suddenly twisted her body and bit down hard on his hand. Morrison howled in pain and loosened his hold just enough for Sarah to break free. She rolled away from the soldiers and came up near her father's workbench. On the bench sat her father's tools and several items he had been repairing, including a double-barreled shotgun that belonged to the village blacksmith. Sarah grabbed it and quickly checked the chambers. "Both barrels were loaded. Everyone freeze," she shouted, swinging the shotgun toward the group of soldiers. Morrison laughed despite the blood trickling from his bitten hand. "That's an old hunting gun, sweetheart. You get 2 shots and there are 6 of us. Basic math says you lose." "Maybe," Sarah replied, her voice steadier now. "But which 2 of you want to be the ones who don't walk away?" For the first time since entering the shop, Morrison's men showed hesitation. They had signed up to steal weapons from defenseless villagers, not face someone who clearly knew how to use firearms and had nothing left to lose. Sarah backed toward the trapdoor again, keeping the shotgun trained on Morrison. "Here's what's going to happen," she said. "You're going to put down your weapons and walk out of my father's shop. Take whatever you've already loaded in your truck, but leave us alone." "Or what?" Morrison demanded, though he made no move to advance on her. "Or I start shooting, and we see how many of you are still standing when the smoke clears." The standoff stretched for several tense seconds. Sarah could see the soldiers weighing their options, Morrison calculating odds, and her father preparing to move if the shooting started again. Then everything changed when voices came from outside the shop. The people of the village had heard the gunshots and commotion, and they were gathering in the street. Sarah could hear her neighbors calling out, asking if everyone was all right. Morrison's expression darkened as he realized his situation was becoming more complicated. A simple weapons seizure was turning into a public incident with witnesses. His military superiors wouldn't appreciate the attention or the questions that would follow. "Captain," one of his younger soldiers said quietly, "maybe we should just take what we have and go. We've got most of the weapons already." "Shut up, Private," Morrison snapped. But Sarah could see him thinking, weighing the consequences of escalating the situation further. That's when her father made his move. While everyone was focused on Sarah and her shotgun, he had been quietly working his way toward Morrison's dropped pistol. He suddenly stood up behind his table, the weapon in his hands. "Captain Morrison," her father said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through real wars, not just bullied defenseless villagers. "You have 30 seconds to get your men out of my shop before I start. Treating you like the enemy. Soldiers I faced 20 years ago." Morrison looked back and forth between Sarah with her shotgun and her father with his pistol. His own men were spread out and partially covered, but not in good position for a firefight. The voices outside were getting louder and closer. "You're making a big mistake, old man," Morrison said. "I'll be back with more soldiers. This village will pay for this disrespect." "Maybe," Sarah's father replied calmly. "But today you leave." Morrison seemed to come to a decision. He gestured to his men to lower their weapons. "Fall back to the truck," he ordered. "We'll deal with this situation through proper military channels." Sarah didn't trust his sudden compliance, and she was right to be suspicious. As Morrison moved toward the door, he suddenly spun and lunged toward the workbench where several small weapons were still displayed. His plan was clear: grab a gun and end this standoff permanently. But Sarah had been watching for exactly this kind of move. She swung the shotgun toward him and pulled one trigger. The blast was deafening in the confined space, and the shot pattern struck Morrison in the shoulder and side, spinning him around and sending him crashing into a display case. Morrison hit the floor hard but wasn't seriously wounded. However, the shot had the effect Sarah was hoping for. His soldiers, seeing their leader down and hearing the angry voices of villagers gathering outside, decided they had had enough. "We're leaving," one of them shouted. This wasn't supposed to be a war zone. They grabbed Morrison under his arms and dragged him toward the door. He was conscious but dazed, blood seeping through his torn uniform. As they hauled him outside, he managed to look back at Sarah with pure hatred in his eyes. "This isn't over, girl," he gasped. "You'll pay for this." Sarah kept the shotgun pointed at them until they were completely out of the shop. Through the broken window, she watched them load Morrison into their truck along with the weapons they had already taken. The engine started, and within moments they were driving away from the village at high speed. Her father slumped against his overturned table, finally allowing exhaustion and pain to show on his face. Sarah rushed to his side, setting down the shotgun and helping him sit more comfortably. "Are you all right, Papa?" she asked, examining his head wound. "I'll live," he said with a weak smile. "But I think we may have made some powerful enemies today." Through the doorway, Sarah could see the faces of their neighbors who had gathered outside. Some looked worried, others appeared proud, and a few seemed frightened of what might come next. Sarah helped her father to his feet and looked around at the destroyed shop. Much of their inventory was gone, and what remained was scattered and damaged. But they were alive, and they had stood up to bullies who thought they could take whatever they wanted. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. Her father looked at her with new respect. "Now we prepare for whatever comes next. Because Morrison was right about one thing, this isn't over." 3 days passed after Morrison and his soldiers fled the village, but Sarah knew the calm wouldn't last. Word traveled fast in the mountain communities, and she heard whispers that the captain was gathering reinforcements from the military base 50 miles away. He was telling everyone that the village was harboring dangerous rebels who had attacked government forces. Sarah spent those 3 days preparing for what she knew would come. She helped her father clean up the destroyed shop and took inventory of what weapons remained hidden in the basement storage. More importantly, she practiced with every firearm they still possessed, pushing her shooting skills beyond anything she had ever attempted before. Her father watched her work with a mixture of pride and worry. Sarah, you know you don't have to do this. We could leave the village, start over somewhere else. Running won't solve anything, she replied, adjusting the sights on her grandfather's Winchester. Morrison won't stop until someone stops him. Besides, this is our home. The village had split into two groups. Some families wanted to flee before more soldiers arrived. Others, inspired by Sarah's courage, were organizing to defend their community. The village blacksmith had begun forging makeshift weapons, and several of the older men who had military experience were sharing their knowledge with younger volunteers. Sarah's reputation had grown beyond what she was comfortable with. People were calling her the girl who shot Captain Morrison, and looking to her for leadership she didn't feel ready to provide. She was still just 18 years old, and the weight of everyone's expectations was crushing. On the evening of the third day, scouts reported military vehicles approaching the village from 3 different directions. Morrison had returned with at least 30 soldiers, along with equipment that suggested he meant to crush any resistance permanently. Sarah stood on the roof of her father's shop with a pair of binoculars, studying the approaching forces. In the failing light, she could see trucks, jeeps, and what looked like a small armored vehicle. Morrison had clearly convinced his superiors that the village posed a serious threat. Her father climbed up to join her on the roof. It's too many, Sarah. Even if every person in the village could fight, we're outnumbered 5 to 1. Numbers aren't everything, Sarah said, though her heart was pounding with fear. We know this terrain better than they do, and we're fighting for our homes while they're fighting for Morrison's wounded pride. The plan they had developed was simple but dangerous. The village's defenders would take positions in the surrounding hills and forest, using the natural cover to their advantage. Sarah would position herself in the old church bell tower, which provided the best vantage point for long-range shooting. As darkness fell, the military convoy stopped just outside the village limits. Bright spotlights illuminated the main street, and Morrison's voice echoed from a loudspeaker mounted on one of the vehicles. People of Cedar Ridge. His amplified voice boomed. You are harboring criminals who attacked military personnel. Surrender the perpetrators immediately, or this entire village will be considered a hostile zone. Sarah moved through the shadows to reach the church, carrying her grandfather's Winchester and a bag of ammunition. The bell tower was a perfect sniper's nest, with clear sight lines to all the main approaches to the village. She climbed the narrow wooden stairs, each step bringing her closer to a confrontation she had never imagined. From her position in the tower, Sarah could see Morrison's forces spreading out in a wide circle around the village. They were using military tactics, establishing overlapping fields of fire and setting up communications equipment. This wasn't a simple raid anymore, it was a full-scale military operation. Morrison's voice came over the loudspeaker again. You have 1 hour to surrender the Chen girl and her accomplices. After that, we will consider all villagers to be enemy combatants. Sarah felt a chill of fear and anger. Morrison wasn't just coming for her anymore. He was threatening everyone she had ever known and cared about. This had become bigger than a personal vendetta. It was about whether people had the right to defend themselves against corrupt authority. She set up her shooting position carefully, testing different angles and ranges. The church tower put her about 400 yards from the main military position, a challenging but manageable distance for someone with her skills. She had hit targets at that range many times during hunting trips with her father, but as she prepared for what might be her last battle, Sarah realized something that changed everything. Through her rifle scope, she could see individual soldiers moving around the military vehicles. Most of them looked young, barely older than herself. They weren't evil men. They were just following orders from a captain who had lied to them about what they were facing. Morrison's hour passed slowly. Sarah watched through her scope as the captain moved between his positions, clearly building up to something dramatic. He wanted to make an example of the village that would be remembered throughout the region. At exactly midnight, Morrison's voice boomed across the village one final time. Your hour is up. All civilians have 30 seconds to evacuate before we begin our assault. Sarah took a deep breath and made a decision that would define the rest of her life. Instead of waiting for the soldiers to attack, she would take control of the situation. She aimed carefully at the spotlight mounted on Morrison's command vehicle and squeezed the trigger. The powerful light exploded in a shower of sparks and glass, plunging that section of the military position into darkness. Before anyone could react, Sarah had already cycled her rifle's action and was aiming at the next spotlight. Her second shot was just as precise, destroying another light and creating more confusion among the soldiers. She could hear Morrison shouting orders, but his men were struggling to locate where the shots were coming from. Sarah's plan was working. By eliminating their lights, she was forcing the soldiers to fight on more equal terms. They had lost their technological advantage and would have to rely on the same night vision and forest skills that she had grown up with. But Morrison quickly adapted to the new situation. Within minutes, Sarah could see muzzle flashes from multiple positions as the soldiers began firing toward the church tower. Bullets whined overhead and chipped stone from the tower walls. Sarah knew she had announced her position and would have to move soon. But first she wanted to send Morrison a more personal message. She adjusted her scope and searched for the captain's distinctive silhouette among the chaos of his military position. Through the scope, she found him crouched behind his command vehicle, holding a radio and coordinating his forces. He was about 450 yards away, partially concealed and constantly moving. It would be the most difficult shot of her life. Sarah controlled her breathing, calculated wind direction and bullet drop, and slowly squeezed the trigger. The Winchester bucked against her shoulder, and through the scope, she saw Morrison spin and fall behind his vehicle. She didn't know if she had hit him or if he had simply dove for better cover, but the effect on his soldiers was immediate. Their coordinated attack dissolved into confusion as they lost contact with their commander. The confusion in Morrison's ranks lasted only minutes before a new voice took command over their radio system. Sarah could hear the crackle of military communications echoing across the valley as someone else organized the scattered soldiers. She had bought the village some time, but the battle was far from over. From her position in the bell tower, Sarah watched as groups of soldiers began moving through the forest in organized search patterns. They were hunting for her specifically now, using tactics designed to flush out a single sniper. She counted at least 12 men advancing on the church from different directions. Sarah gathered her ammunition and began her descent from the tower. Staying in one position would be suicide against so many trained soldiers. She needed to use her knowledge of the village and surrounding area to stay ahead of them. As she reached the bottom of the church stairs, Sarah heard boots on the wooden steps of the building's main entrance. The soldiers had reached her faster than expected. She slipped out through the church's back door just as flashlight beams began sweeping through the interior. The village streets that Sarah had known all her life now felt like a maze of shadows and danger. She moved carefully between houses, using garden walls and sheds for cover. Behind her, she could hear soldiers calling to each other as they systematically searched every building. Her destination was the old mine shaft on the hill behind the village. It had been abandoned for decades, but Sarah and her friends had explored every tunnel and chamber during their childhood adventures. The mine would give her multiple escape routes and elevated positions for shooting. As she climbed the rocky path toward the mine entrance, Sarah heard vehicles starting up in the military camp. They were bringing in heavier equipment now, probably preparing to level the entire village if they couldn't find her. The thought of her neighbors' homes being destroyed because of her actions made her stomach twist with guilt. But when she reached the mine entrance and looked back at the village below, Sarah saw something that gave her hope. Lights were moving through the forest in patterns that weren't random or panicked. The other village defenders were implementing the plan they had discussed, using coordinated movements to confuse and harass the soldiers. Sarah set up her shooting position at the mine entrance, where collapsed timber beams provided natural cover. From this elevated position, she had clear sight lines to most of the military vehicles and equipment. More importantly, she could see individual soldiers moving through the village streets. She loaded her rifle carefully and began what would become legendary among mountain communities for generations. Over the next 2 hours, Sarah fired exactly 12 shots, and each one found its target with devastating precision. Her first shot disabled the radio antenna on the command vehicle, cutting off communications between the scattered soldier units. The second shot punctured the fuel tank of their armored car, creating a spreading pool of gasoline that forced them to move their equipment. The third and fourth shots took out the tires of 2 military trucks, stranding soldiers who had been planning to retreat if the situation became untenable. Sarah wasn't trying to kill anyone if she could avoid it, but she was systematically destroying their ability to function as an organized force. With her fifth shot, Sarah accomplished something that seemed impossible even to her. She spotted a soldier preparing to throw a grenade toward a house where she knew the Miller family was hiding. The distance was over 500 yards, The target was moving, and she had only seconds to act. Her bullet struck the grenade in the soldier's hand, detonating it safely in the air and saving the family below. Word of that shot spread among both the villagers and the soldiers. For the defenders, it was proof that they had a guardian angel watching over them. For Morrison's men, it was terrifying evidence that they were facing someone with almost supernatural shooting abilities. Sarah's 6th through 9th shots each disabled a different piece of military equipment: a searchlight generator, a communications trailer, a weapons rack, and the engine of their remaining functional vehicle. With each shot, the soldiers' technological advantages disappeared, reducing them to the same level as the village defenders they had come to intimidate. The 10th shot was personal. Sarah spotted Morrison himself, wounded but still trying to coordinate his forces from behind a makeshift barricade. She aimed carefully and put a bullet through his helmet, knocking it clean off his head without touching a hair. It was a message that she could have killed him any time she chose. By her 11th shot, something remarkable was happening. Several of Morrison's soldiers had stopped fighting entirely and were actively looking for ways to surrender or escape. They had signed up to bully defenseless villagers, not face a phantom sniper who seemed to hit impossible targets in complete darkness. Sarah saved her 12th and final shot for the most important target of all. She had been watching a young soldier who reminded her of her own younger brother. He was clearly terrified and had been trying to help wounded comrades rather than participate in the attack. When she saw an older soldier threatening to shoot him for cowardice, Sarah made her decision. Her final bullet struck the ground directly between the older soldier's feet, sending up a shower of dirt and pebbles. The message was unmistakable: stop threatening the boy or the next shot would be lethal. As dawn broke over the valley, an amazing scene unfolded. Morrison's 30-soldier force had been reduced to a handful of men still willing to fight. Most had either fled into the forest or were actively surrendering to village defenders. Their equipment was destroyed, their communications were cut, and their leader was wounded and demoralized. Sarah emerged from the mine as the sun climbed higher, her grandfather's Winchester empty but her mission accomplished. She walked down the hill toward the village where her neighbors were gathering in the main street. The soldiers who remained were laying down their weapons and asking for medical treatment for their wounded. Morrison himself was sitting against his damaged command vehicle, his shoulder bandaged and his pride completely shattered. When he saw Sarah approaching, his face showed a mixture of fear, hatred, and grudging respect. 12 shots, he said bitterly. 12 impossible shots without a single miss. Who taught you to shoot like that? My grandfather, Sarah replied simply. He always said that if something is worth shooting at, it's worth hitting. The aftermath of that night changed everything for the mountain villages. News of Sarah's incredible marksmanship spread throughout the region, and Morrison's superiors faced difficult questions about why a simple weapons seizure had turned into a military disaster. Morrison himself was court-martialed for exceeding his authority and lying to his commanders about the nature of the threat. Several of his soldiers testified about his brutality and the illegal tactics he had employed against civilian populations. Sarah became famous throughout the country as the girl who hit 12 bullseyes without a miss, though she never sought the attention or glory. She used her newfound reputation to advocate for the rights of rural communities, to defend themselves against corruption and abuse of power. Years later, when people asked her about that incredible night, Sarah would always say the same thing: I wasn't trying to be a hero. I was just a daughter protecting her father and neighbors protecting their home. Sometimes that's all it takes to change the world. The old Winchester rifle that had belonged to her grandfather was eventually displayed in the village museum, along with a simple plaque that read, "Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right even when you are."